Many of you know that when I was in college, I was part of the track and cross country team, and one of the most memorable races from the track seasons that I had was my junior year. We were in Dubuque, and I had been running fine, like my times were just okay, but I had reached kind of this point of plateauing, just running the same times over and over again, and it was very comfortable. I was just doing my thing and placing, but not really like running too many personal bests. And my coach had noticed this as the weeks had gone by and as the races had gone by. And so we showed up, and I was scheduled to run the 3K, which is just a little bit less than 2 miles. And so she came up to me, and we always had like this little meeting before the race started, just to go over like the strategy for the race and like how I was going to run it. And so she came up to me and she was like, "You see those 2 runners over there?" And she points to the 2 fastest runners in the entire race. And I was like, "Yeah." She was like, "I want you to get right up onto their hip and stay there as long as you can." And I was like, "Okay, this is gonna be uncomfortable. This is gonna force me out of my comfort zone." And she was like, "Just do it and see what happens." And so the race starts, the gun goes off, and within like the first 300 meters, I was like, "This is gonna be terrible." So we get like halfway through, and I'm still there, and by the end of the race, I'm still with them, and cross the finish line with like a 20-second personal best. And I was done. I like got to like back to the camp where we had our stuff, and I was completely exhausted. I was like, "Well, this is how Grant perishes, and this is how Grant passes away, is he completely exhausts himself in this long distance race." And my coach came up to me, and she like knelt down next to me, and she was like, "That's the best race that I've ever seen you run." I was like, "Thank you, coach. Thank you." And she stood up and she was like, "Just a little bit of suffering." And then she walked away. Just a little bit of suffering. Right? We hear this famous story from the gospel today that we've heard many, many times. Jesus and his disciples, they are traveling through Caesarea Philippi, and he turns to them and he says, "What have people been saying about me? What have you been hearing?" And they're like, "Well, some people say that you're like John the Baptist, and some people say you're like Elijah, maybe one of the prophets." And he says to them, "Well, that's great, but who do you say that I am?" And so Peter says the famous response, "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the one who has come to save us." And Jesus says, "Great, that's true. That's the correct answer. But what does that mean? What does that look like?" Because the next part, that's the difficult part. Because Jesus says, "This is what it means for me to be the Messiah. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to be beaten to within an inch of my life, and then I'm going to die on the cross to save humanity from its sins. I'm going to suffer." And Jesus says, "No, that's not what you're going to do, because that's not comfortable. That's not what we're used to hearing." And I think for us today, the first part of the gospel is much simpler than the second. Because I think with our heads, we can say, "Yes, Christ, you are who you say you are. You are the Messiah. You are the one who has come to save us from our sins." But moving from the head to the heart, that's the step of suffering. Because using our head to reason our way to Jesus is comfortable. But suffering for Christ, that takes the entirety of our heart and our souls. So maybe you go to Mass on Sundays, but you don't take those little moments throughout the day to communicate with the Lord, to pray with Him, right? Those little acts of suffering that we can do throughout the week to sacrifice ourselves for the Lord. And that looks different for each and every one of us. We all have different crosses that we are called to carry. And we work, right, to overcome suffering in all of its aspects, but we are called to bear it, not to banish it, not to erase it, because Christ has redeemed suffering through His cross and through His resurrection. Because it is when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from things that involve discomfort that we drift into a relationship with Jesus that does become stagnant, that does become comfortable, right? Just like the racing, we continue to run the same times, we continue to go through the same actions, right? But that development of, right, a healthy relationship with the Lord requires that discomfort, requires those little sufferings throughout the day. Because it is not by sidestepping suffering that we are healed, but rather by the capacity we have for accepting it, maturing through that suffering and finding meaning through union with Christ, who suffered through that infinite love for us upon the cross. Just a little bit of suffering, right? Just like my coach said, just a little bit of suffering still hurts, and it's still terrible, but we must endure through it because it has been redeemed, and because on the other side of that suffering is the hope of the resurrection. Because as Christians, we cannot see the glory that is the resurrection without passing through Good Friday first. But once we do that, once we take that step, once we take that purgative step, as St. John of the Cross would call it, all suffering becomes a means of redemption and an act of praise to the Lord.